Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Beth Keelty. I'm the CMO here at PMX Agency. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. We're really excited to cover today's materials, which, as you know, focus on how the new administration might impact charitable giving and advocacy. We have two of our subject matter experts here with us who are going to lead this conversation. Bethany Mackey is our Vice President of Nonprofit Strategy, and Glenn Lalage, our Vice President of Research. We'll have about 35 minutes of content, and then we'll open it up for Q&A to address any specific questions you might have. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have a question, please use the chat feature, and as I said, we will answer that at the end of the session. Also, this event is being recorded, and we will distribute the recording and the materials in the next couple of days. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Glenn. Glenn?
Thanks, Mary Beth. Yes, I am Glenn, and I'm delighted to be joined here by Bethany, and the two of us are going to talk about our latest study, Charitable Giving and Advocacy in the Trump Era. But before we wade into the political waters, I want to talk a bit about who we are. PMX Agency is an integrated brand and performance marketing agency. We've been around 27 years. We have over 300 associates in offices across the U.S. 2016 was a particularly big year for us. If you look in the upper right there, you'll see we formed strategic partnerships with several global agencies. We rebranded as PMX Agency, and we gained a majority stakeholder with the Stagwell Group. So in the diagram below, just generally illustrates our approach to your business and, more importantly, your customers. And surrounding the variety of services that we offer are research, data, analytics, and strategy. And that was true the day of the company's inception and is very much true today. So, Bethany, would you like to talk for a moment about our client work?
Sure, Glenn. So PMX serves both nonprofit clients as well as commercial clients. We have, as most of you know, been in the nonprofit business for almost 30 years, and our roots started in direct mail list brokerage, and over the last several decades have expanded that out to a full-service nonprofit offering in digital and integrated multi-channel work. We are very lucky to learn from our commercial side of the house, working with brands such as North Face and Crayola, Sperry Topsider, Forbes, so we get to tap a lot of that learning and those same subject matter experts who are working on some of the biggest commercial brands you'd recognize for our nonprofit clients.
So as I mentioned previously, in 2016, we joined the Stagwell Network, working alongside some truly spectacular companies, PR firm SDK, Knickerbocker, and digital creative agency Code and Theory, just to name two. But there's also on that top row, you'll see NRG National Research Group. They are the sister company that we collaborated with for this new study. So just to give them their due here, NRG was founded in 1978. It's a leading provider of market research and strategic consultation. They have a focus on both qualitative and quantitative research. They were previously part of Nielsen. All right. So with that, the question is always good to ask why we did the study to start with. So we've been talking to NRG for a few months now about a variety of new initiatives. Well, one key area that kept coming up was the presidential election, and particularly the potential impact of such a volatile kind of political climate, especially on non-political charitable giving. So for a bit of background, PMX has studied presidential elections in the past, actually hidden underneath, but on the left there are some of our prior reporting, typically based on historic response data. And as you can see, these go back all the way to like 2000. Historically, no matter how an election seemed at the time, and you'll see we consider 2008, if you can make it out there in the middle of the image on the left, we consider it an historic election because it was Obama versus McCain. But anyway, at the end of all of those, we kind of came up with the same thing. There was potentially a little distortion or distraction a week or two before the election, during the week of, maybe a little bit afterwards. But by and large, it was kind of, they were minor blips that did not adversely impact live campaigns. 2016 was different. Kind of early in the year, I innocently thought this campaign is not like other ones I recall. It's a little more charged, a little nuttier, et cetera. But I kind of did think that it would look like a campaign I recognized by June or July. I think we all did. But that was not the case and is not the case. 2016 election revealed sharp divisions, which remained largely unchanged post-election. creating, and depending on where you stand, sustained coverage, passion, concern, and action. So then we were like, so how do we quantify this kind of unprecedented election's effect on charitable giving? So to start finding out why, we worked with NRG on a survey to get at what impact the election might have on 2017. And the kind of things we wanted to know were sort of like which sectors did Trump versus Clinton supporters donate to in 16, how much, did they plan to give the same or more in 17, and kind of also equally important, had their priorities changed, and did the change in priorities potentially alter which nonprofit sectors or categories they were going to support. And given sort of many of the protests and things like that, we were also interested in whether attitudes or willingness to advocate on behalf of a cause had changed. And so the backbone here of the survey, we got responses from 1,000 adults in the U.S., age 18 plus. We did have the criteria they had to have donated money to a charitable cause in the past 12 months. I think we're all very interested in what new to file or new donors might look like and what's going on there. But to set a baseline, we wanted folks that already saw themselves as charitable donors and to understand what impact the election was having on them. A survey was conducted online, and we fielded it on January 27th. And that date is notable for a few reasons, and we're going to touch on that in just like a slide or two. So before we get into the actual findings, we really do need to spend just a few minutes talking about kind of the unquestionable impact of the news cycle on charitable giving. The inauguration of President Donald Trump in January kind of provoked large-scale media coverage, which highlighted a wide variety of issues and causes. And that first week after the inauguration really reinforced how rapidly charitable interest can shift based on coverage and current events. And as you review this, do keep in mind, I mentioned this before, about we fielded January 27th, which means we captured sentiment around the inauguration itself on the 20th, which was enthusiastically attended or viewed on TV by Trump supporters. Captured also the sentiment from the Women's March from January 21st, which drew an estimated 4.8 million people. But on the day we fielded it is also the day that Trump signed the executive order on immigration. And so we don't have that fully captured in the sentiment for this particular study, and we do know it had some impact. I believe ACLU raised, $24 million or something like that in 2 days. But it's a little bit more thinking about current events in the media. On the left there is a quadrant analysis done by the New York Times. And essentially, it's rating sort of normal to abnormal, important and not important. And in this context, by the way, abnormal in a political sense means sort of highly unusual in contemporary American democracy, and important means has consequences on federal policy. And they took 20 actions, events, et cetera, and put them in this matrix, and sort of like the number of things which appear in that upper right quadrant is really striking. All of those were major news. Not only that, 3 of them were about the news. Alternative facts and fact news, tweeting about foreign affairs, characterization of media as enemies. So beyond current events and the coverage of them affecting charitable interest, the media in and of itself has become a factor in giving behaviors. And based on our survey results, there's also great concern among Clinton voters about freedom of the press. 77% expressed concern. In contrast, only 18% of Trump voters expressed similar concerns. This has all sorts of ramifications. It's certainly been good news for media, and we included a snip, I think it was from the end of last year, about Washington Post hiring. And as Bethany's going to touch on in a few other slides, media and freedom of the press has also taken on its own kind of cause, potentially on par with other charitable causes in terms of importance to donors. So, related to news, we asked some questions of those who made a charitable contribution in the past 12 months about news and social media consumption. And for these questions, we were particularly interested in differences by age. So we first asked about news media, and essentially it's like, where do you get your news? And they were allowed to pick more than one thing. So for donors under 45, the number one source for news was social media at 57%, followed by local TV news, national network news, and online-only sources at number 4. And if you're wondering what the gold stars are, I'll explain in a second. For those over 45, however, it's different. The top 2 sources are TV, local TV and national network news, Number 3 is local newspapers, which doesn't even appear in the other top 5, which is why it has a star. Say we turn it over. So the things with stars are things which are of significance to one age bracket, but not at all to the other. So, and we also asked about social media, but this wasn't about news. We just asked about what social media platforms, apps, etc. they used. And so for those under 45, Facebook, as you would expect, was like a whopping 87%. YouTube was also very high at 74%, and Instagram was majority, 52%, over half of those under 45 regularly use Instagram. By contrast, for those 45 and older, Facebook is also high, not quite as high, but it's certainly dominant. But everything else is considerably less. YouTube at 39, Twitter at 21, and notably, and that's why I have Instagram circled, Instagram, 52% used regularly by donors under 45, doesn't even show up in the top 5 for those over 45. And we also asked about donors' preferred giving methods. And for those under 45, giving via a website was the preferred giving venue, followed by a distant second of postal mail at 25, and then phone and email. And as you might guess, if you're familiar with, nonprofit donors, on the 45 and up side, postal mail is actually still dominant at 53%, websites at 34%. So those two actually are higher in combination than under 45, but still postal mail rules, websites, then phone and email. So I think Bethany has a few thoughts on the news cycle and the sources and what that might mean for nonprofits. So we want to give her a chance to speak here.
Sure. Thanks, Glenn. So when we think about the connection between the news cycle and sort of hyper news consumption and how different mediums are affecting giving behavior, it poses some very interesting challenges for us as nonprofit strategists. So I think the first thing that came to my mind is operational speed. I'm sure that a lot of you take several months to get a campaign out the door. So being reactive to a news cycle, unless that's in your DNA as an organization, as a rapid response organization that has a real advocacy bent to it, operational speed can be a real challenge. So I think as part of strategic planning, sitting down with those folks who are the decision makers and figuring out how do you get a campaign out quickly. Our organizations that are steeped in disaster response fundraising obviously have operational rules around getting something out the door quickly, but this is something like we haven't seen. It's sort of that emergency catalyst, but in a sustained way. So solving for the operational speed of campaign concept to deployment definitely should be on everybody's radar. We'll get into a little bit more into content strategy and sub-narratives later, but I think from a medium perspective, we need to talk about content strategy up front in that operational nimbleness context because, as we all know, direct mail is a huge piece of our financial puzzles. So figuring out how mail pieces that feel culturally relevant in the news cycle, if we are trying to align ourselves with that context. How do we do that when we've got a 3 to 6 month production window? So talking about elevating sub-narratives, which we'll get into later, versus specific news events themselves. I think the other thing to really take out of this upfront section here on media and its effect on charitable giving is just that increased cultural awareness that we as fundraisers need to have. Our competitive sets are going to be shifting in a way we haven't really seen before in fundraising. So the current events are very much driving the cause du jour when you look at ACLU and Planned Parenthood, some of our environmental causes that have seen huge spikes in fundraising revenue because of the media coverage and the concern of, in that case, progressive donors. So having somebody on your team who is running point for trying to stay on top of and a little bit ahead of what that news cycle looks like is really important. Glenn also mentioned that the press itself is in some ways becoming our competition for fundraising. So we're seeing, you'll see here in the illustration, the New York Times talking about their mission and having almost more philanthropic language in some of their outreach to their subscribers. There was a story just the other day about how some of the large news outlets like New York Times are inviting journalism students to the White House Correspondents' Dinner as opposed to celebrities in the space. So I think really looking at how the media itself is in some ways becoming competition is something that we have to keep a pulse on. Obviously, we're only 5-6 weeks in here to this administration, so we don't have all the answers of how to solve for these things, but definitely wanted to identify here in our first issue of this study what the trends should be. I think the other thing to note is when we look at the audience breakdowns of the under and over 45 donors for preferred giving venues and what media is affecting their giving, note that doesn't necessarily have a conservative or liberal lens to it as something that was statistically relevant. So when you think about, say, your video strategy for under 45, what does that look like through both a conservative lens as well as a more progressive donor lens, and start thinking through those issues when planning content as well. Glenn, I'll kick it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Bethany. So we asked the question, who is giving and why? So now we want to take a look at what we know about those who gave in 16, what do they anticipate doing in 17, and to the extent possible, what kind of lies underneath any changes. So we asked, has anything changed with anticipated giving under a Trump administration? As you can see in the chart here, the majority of donors, Trump voters and Clinton voters alike, don't anticipate any changes in the amount they gave in 17 versus 16. That's the dark shaded 68% there of the pie. However, nearly a quarter of donors do anticipate giving more in 17 than 16. And that increase is roughly the same between Trump and Clinton voters. Clinton voters are a few points higher at 26%, but they're pretty equally weighted. And we also asked about giving amounts. We're showing both the median and the mean here on 16 versus anticipated for 17. If you just focus on the mean on the far right, you can see that donors overall anticipate increasing their gift amounts by an average of 26% in 17 versus prior year. So it's worth noting that those anticipated charitable increases are coming from all donor levels. On this slide, the y-axis along the left looks at the 2016 average donation amounts, 2017 anticipated donation amounts, and then the percentage increase-decrease. And the x-axis kind of divided into three levels of donors. There's under $100, $100 to $499, or $500 and up. So from this data, high-level donors on the far right plan to increase their giving amounts by an average of 21% in 17. Moving to the middle, the $100 to $499 donors are actually triple that. They're planning on increasing their charitable giving by 72%. And the biggest gain of all, though, looking strictly at the percentages, comes from small donors who plan to increase their giving amounts by over 100% in 2017. It's 107% actually versus 16. So let's take a look at what we have learned from the study about charitable Trump voters. Based on some of our sentiment questions, 63% of Trump voters stated that they have optimism about their personal finances under the new administration. This is in stark contrast to Clinton voters, where only 12% had optimism about their personal finances in the years ahead. And concurrently, the average planned donation amount for 17 is like a 38% increase over 16 for Trump voters, up to $1,600. And this also is significantly more than Clinton voters, who plan to donate an average of $857, which is a 14% increase. And so as we touched on already, and we're going to discuss a bit more, kind of a notable number of Trump voters and Clinton voters both plan to give more in 17. But what is driving them to give is very different, as it may be optimism for Trump voters, but as you'll see in some of the future slides, it's not optimism but concern that is driving Clinton voters. Pulling back sort of from specific parties for a second, there has been growth in overall charity among younger Americans aged 18 to 34. This is partly due to increased political involvement with progressive causes based on survey results. So 54% donated more money to charitable causes in 16. 35% plan to donate more under the Trump administration. Whoops. Apologies. 55% are concerned that organizations they support will be defunded by the Trump administration. 41%, and this is notable, 41% donated to or plan to donate to organizations for the first time because of the election. So I'm going to hand this back to Bethany for a few minutes to get her thoughts on kind of this. I find it interesting, this fairly equal desire to give more for very different reasons, and the level of donors expressing that desire, and also the younger donor. And there's your angry Ben.
Yes, I think probably my favorite graphic in the whole deck here from GQ actually. But I think that there were a few nuggets of data in here that really interested me from a strategy perspective and definitely will illuminate the next iteration of this study. We see that there is a substantial planned growth within that less than $100 donor. We also sort of correlating that to some other data points within the study of diversification of donations among our more liberal donors, as well as the younger Americans point on the previous slide about 41% becoming new donors for a first time. So while we don't have the data points 100% connected, and as I say, something we want to dig into in further studies, we assume that there is this, while an increase at all giving levels, there's a real opportunity to test in this sort of first-time donor under $100 level, and we assume with a more conservative bias in most cases, sort of testing strategy that we need to put out. I think that sort of segues into the data and segmentation underpinnings of what this new era of giving and under this administration means for us. Data overlays are something we, of course, as an industry have always looked at from a basic donor segmentation standpoint, but I think at a minimum, age and political affiliation are critical data overlays to amend at the constituent level within your database in order to be able to do some of this testing that will be needed, especially around these less than $100 donors, but also I think at the mid-level as well.
Thanks,
Back
Bethany.
to you, Glenn.
Yes.
Sure.
So we've talked about how much donors are contemplating giving in 17, but we also really want to understand what types of organizations they're interested in. So at various points so far in the talk, we've directly or indirectly pointed out differences between charitable Trump voters and charitable Clinton voters, but it's really important to note that among the most popular charitable causes, giving is pretty much a bipartisan affair. So if you look at this chart, the percent of Clinton voters who said they supported one of these given causes in 16 is in blue versus the red, which represents Trump voters. And among these 6 most popular causes, disease health, animal welfare, faith-based causes, children, domestic, humanitarian, and military law at the bottom, only faith-based causes really see a really significant partisan divide in terms of donations for 2016. And that it is a notable divide. That's 20% point difference between Clinton and Trump voters on faith-based. But what we're also seeing, based on the answers to our 17 questions, is that the differences are growing. And so we looked at 16 again and ranked them just by the bigger, which had the biggest divide. And so the bracketed number there next to faith-based causes, for instance, there's a 20% point difference between the Trump voters who supported versus Clinton voters who supported. So Trump voters certainly dominate on the faith-based causes. All the others are dominated by Clinton voters. You'll see arts and culture, international humanitarian, environmental, and women's causes. When we asked about 17, however, some really significant changes in those divides. So faith-based is still number 1, and actually that has not changed that much. The Trump voters are up maybe 1%. But there's been quite a shuffle or kind of emergence of new things with regard to the other causes. Women's causes moves to number 2 with a 20% point difference of Clinton voters versus Trump in terms of the disparity. Civil liberties, social causes, domestic humanitarian, those are all new or new to the top 5, if you will. And then at the bottom is environmental causes, which is technically lower, in terms of where it shows up on the top 5, but the differential is higher at 13% versus 10%. So other things we found in the survey underscore how charitable Clinton voters are not driven by optimism but by concern. 69% of Clinton voters are concerned that the organizations they support will be defunded under the Trump administration. 26% of Clinton voters say the election of Donald Trump has made them plan to give more to the charities they care about. And also, running along on the bottom there, among Clinton voters planning to give more in 17, these are the following causes saw the greatest increase in donation interest between 16 and 17. And these will start to sound familiar by the time we're in, but women's causes, civil liberties, education, disease health is in here, environmental and international humanitarian causes. So kind of as we work our way through the various slices of charitable donation answers we receive from Clinton voters, it did become clear that the greatest increase in intent among Clinton voters who have stated that they anticipate giving more in 17, it aligns with those causes that they also perceive are the most likely to be impacted. So, we asked what type of causes, charities do you think will be most under threat during a Trump administration? And you can see here again, starting at the far left, women's causes, environmental, civil liberty, international humanitarian, arts and culture, and education. And the gaps are really notable here between the Clinton voters and Trump voters on these causes. On the Trump side, however, faith and military lead, which we've already sort of pointed out, Trump voters are nearly as likely, if you recall, as Clinton voters to say that the election has made them plan to give more. So they're pretty equal on that front. But for Trump voters, it's most likely due to perceptions of financial security or optimism. But their giving priorities in 17 really haven't changed that much. Or put more simply, Trump voters are optimistic. They plan to give more, but they're pretty much planning on giving more to the same types of organizations they gave to in 16 into 17. And
I think it's an important strategy piece, Glenn, to point out that if you know that you have conservative voters on file and that their catalyst for giving is an increased sense of financial well-being, what does that mean for donor retention? So, we're sort of default trained to write our appeals in that very hardcore need. But can you weave together the need narrative as well as playing on and appealing to that sense of increased financial security? And that takes copywriters far more creative than I, but something to sit down with your creative team and talk about.
Yeah, and I would note actually just this general feeling of optimism, which can have financial security, just a different approach.
Right. So in terms of what the split of who cares about what and why is relevant to us as fundraisers, I think it really boils down to authentic and relevant narratives. So I think it's critical to not abandon who you are, but we can't be ignorant of the times in which we live. So I think a renewed sense of developing sub-narratives and figuring out where you can play in that space is really important to discuss with your creative teams right now. So can you establish a narrative connection, if you are a military nonprofit or a veteran-focused nonprofit, what's your women's storyline, knowing that the liberal donors on your file are going to care a lot about that right now and that women's causes could be a detractor from your retention efforts. Similarly with disease programs and health research, what are the female-specific or the social justice-specific pieces of your narrative that you can highlight to the two known politically affiliated donors? So I think, really matrixing it out and figuring out where you can be relevant and staying away from the areas where you can't be authentic and not reaching too far in creating those culturally relevant narratives is the key here.
Okay. Thank you. So, wrapping up our talk here, we did ask questions about varying degrees of advocacy and or engagement among Trump voters versus Clinton voters. And I think, while Trump voters plan to give more money to charity, we've already mentioned how those donations are relatively the same areas and they're considerably concentrated in faith-based. Clinton voters, by contrast, say the election has made them more likely to spread their donations out to multiple causes and to advocate on behalf of causes. And if we look at the charted numbers at the bottom on the left, 69% of Clinton voters are concerned that the organizations they support will be defunded, moving to 36% plan to spread their donations out more, and 63% plan to advocate more under a Trump administration. So we kind of wanted to understand that the advocacy play, or the advocacy gap, if you will. So if we look at all the various advocacy and engagement activities asked about, the distinction between Clinton voters and Trump voters is actually clearer. Clinton voters are more eager to participate in pretty much all activities, more than Trump voters. And these range, by the way, from something as simple or easy, if you will, on the far left, as sign an online petition, all the way to the right, the most difficult, the most committed action, which is visiting a government representative in person. But the highlighted section in blue is particularly notable as the Clinton voter divide here is the strongest. It's like 11 percentage points or more. And they are all fairly committed actions. Emailing a senator, not just clicking a box and sending, like emailing a senator, calling a senator, or joining a march or protest. And if we looked at all 12, play this against all 12 of the causes that we included in this particular study, or sectors, I should say, Clinton voters are also lead in virtually all causes in terms of being willing to advocate on behalf of animal welfare, children's causes, disease health, all the way across. The only exception is on the far right is that Trump voters who are charitable givers are more likely, considerably actually, to advocate on behalf of military veterans causes and faith-based causes. And the last thing I will note here is like that blue on the bottom series of charts, again, these similar organizations that you'll see where the gap is the widest: women's causes, domestic humanitarian, environmental, civil liberties, international humanitarian relief, education, and arts, and the arts and culture. And our last slide of data here, as we wanted to share, was on age and advocacy and or engagement. While I think most of us would assume the younger donors are going to be more highly engaged, but I think it's helpful to put some numbers around that. So we have the 3 age brackets across the top and some sample advocacy or engagement activity. So the willingness to volunteer, 75% of those 18 to 34 said they were willing to volunteer for a cause in 17, this versus 61% for 35 to 54 and 48% for 55. Willingness to join a march or protest, 18 to 34 is also the largest at 37%. And willing to encourage friends and family to donate is also a high, similar to willing to volunteer. It's a very high 71%. That's versus the 55% or 41% for age 55 plus. So with that, Bethany, can you talk to us a bit about kind of this connecting advocacy and fundraising, as well as just our overall conclusions on this study?
Sure. So we all know best practice, connecting advocacy and fundraising. We've seen it as a standard piece of data in benchmark studies in the industry for the last several years. But I think the current climate post-election really elevates that to the forefront, especially among our more liberal donors, where we see an increased competition happening. So that is your more distracted donor base versus, if you remember, the conservative donors, they were going to give more, but the distraction wasn't there. So in this slide, we have our Clinton voters are giving out of a catalyst of concern that things will be defunded or that they are at risk. They're planning to spread out their donations more because of that. We are surmising, and we'll dig deeper into that in following iterations of the study, that that means we are likely to see that's where that increase in that under $100 donor is coming because of that spread out donation, and that this group is also willing to advocate more. So we can really use advocacy as a retention mechanism, because now that you're going to have these under $100 donors that are distracted and giving to more folks, the people who are engaging with them, communicating, hyper-communicating, I would say, about their donation and their activist impact on a regular basis and giving them something non-financial to do, sign petitions, share things on social, make calls to their legislators, attend virtual town halls, things like that, is going to be a really key retention strategy for the conservative donor base. I think one of the other interesting things in terms of engagement is on the age bracket slide. Previously, when we looked at donors 55 plus who said that they were willing to encourage family and friends to donate, I think that is not something I would have naturally thought of what sort of social and connectivity engagement do we need to bake in for our older donors, regardless of political affiliation, for them to be able to encourage those family and friends to donate in this time. All right. In terms of what's next for us, this is obviously our first pass at this kind of data. We wanted to field this study to really inform a lot about what's next. So for us, the things that really bubbled up that matter, that are being affected by the current political climate, as we spoke about, cultural awareness, being on top of that news cycle and how things are being talked about, operational nimbleness, sitting down with those folks who control the data within your organization, control the business process of campaign concept through execution, budgeting and really investing in that constituent data in a way that we haven't before, and making sure that it's updated on a regular basis. I would, my personal preference would be to start with age and political affiliation here, in addition to our sort of normal suite of things that we as fundraisers care about. Looking at that segmentation strategy born out of that data, do you have two sides of a story to tell, and really working through that, and being authentic and relevant in those sub-narratives. So not overreaching to tie yourself to the current news cycle and the things that have bubbled up as important topics of the day, but reach where you can to make yourself relevant in the current context. And then, as we just talked about, connecting that catalyst for giving, whether it's the coming from a place of optimism and financial security, or coming from a place of feeling the causes that matter to you are threatened, and connecting those with the right engagement opportunities. So those are themes that we want to dig in further areas of this study. So Glenn, could I get the next slide, please?
You can.
Thank you.
So I'm going to lead you off. I mean, looking ahead, we are anxious for feedback. We've gotten good feedback so far on this initiative, but we are very much looking forward to collaborating with NRG on future quarterly, some frequency charitable giving tracker is what we're calling it at the moment. And I think Bethany can underscore sort of the things that we're looking to achieve with an ongoing poll.
Yeah, I think what our goal is to really create a tool that allows you to define what are the themes that matter in the current political climate when it comes to fundraising and marketing for your organization, whether you are a bipartisan organization or a partisan organization, and whether you're an advocacy organization or not. So I think we really want to create a tool where we are gut checking those themes of what we need to be aware of and changing our operational processes around, and also trying to quantify over a longer period of time that difference between the immediate kind of rage donation phenomenon versus what are the things that are going to matter in the long term over the next 4 years that will affect our fundraising. So as Glenn said, we are hoping to field this study quarterly. We will be reaching out to our clients in terms of how they can be involved in the shaping of those questions and themes that are of interest to them to dig into. So for our current clients that are on the phone, definitely stay tuned for more information on that. And for everybody, we will be, of course, hosting another webinar and potentially some in-person events around the next iteration of the study.
Yeah. Thanks, Bethany. So, yes, the only thing I'll add there is it's like it was it's our first effort, admittedly it's a little broad in certain regards as we kind of felt our way through what kind of responses we were going to get. And we're also very concerned about how people interpret questions because being, on the nonprofit side myself for many years, kind of language I use isn't the kind of language that a donor recognizes or uses. So it's very much sort of a work in progress, but we're very excited to be moving ahead with this. So I'm going to pass it back to Mary Beth.
Great. Thanks, Glenn and Bethany. That was wonderful. We're right on time here. We do have a couple minutes for a few questions. We did get a couple in. So, Glenn, sort of on that same, what you were just talking about in regards to data and methodology, there was a question about whether or not we can look at the data in different ways. Can there be different cuts, et cetera?
Yes, very much. We can cross-tab it in a variety of ways.
Super. And yes, so people can reach out if we want to reach out to us directly if they want to look at data in a couple of different ways.
Yeah, that's the easiest. If someone has a particular way they want to see the data, or they want to know if we can look at a particular way, we'd be happy to get back to them.
Super. Thank you. And then another question, I think, Bethany, to sort of your last slide about, what's next. How, and probably not a single one-off question, but how do people get started being reactive to this information? Any thoughts there?
I think the reactivity for me is sitting down, and it comes down to your story, right? What story are you putting out about your nonprofit? So it's, I think, really doing a good analysis of what we've seen in the news cycle since the election, where you think you can be relevant and lining up behind it, and then getting into the operational and data discussion. But I think it has to start with that, what story you're going to tell and what's the ask, and why do you want to make it in a different way during this time frame.
Great. We did just get another question in, which might be to that, and probably not something you can answer just immediately, but something to think about, Bethany. As we respond to themes in this polarized political climate, do you have any quick tips or strategies for ensuring our fundraising communications don't violate our 501c3 status?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah. So I think that if you are not a C4, if you are not a heavy advocacy oriented nonprofit, sticking in the C3 roots, and really the CTA is still the donate, whether it's unrestricted or to this specific program, and it's the supporting narrative that you are connecting sort of the cause versus the political moment. So if we take a disease charity, for example, and highlighting their women's program, it's more of that subliminal being representative of the fact that women's issues are top of mind, but not coming out and saying directly, this piece of legislation is an assault on, access to women's health care. So I think it is much more subtle than that, to stay authentic to who we are and be legal to who we are as C3.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
If whoever asked that wants to dig further, feel free to email me directly.
Yeah, perfect. That's what I was going to say. And we do have one final question, which is about the data, so we might just need to go back to it. But, Glenn, I'm not sure if you remember, but earlier in the presentation, you mentioned fundraising via phone. Do we know if that related to telemarketing or making a donation to a website or text via a phone?
The question was specifically about how they prefer to actually make their donation. So we did not ask it exactly if it was telemarketing, although I would assume a good part of it is. But I can actually, if we know who asked the question, I can take a closer look and get back to them.
Yep. So we will. I will track all these questions, and we will get back to them. So I think that's. Go ahead.
I think we really appreciate that kind of feedback. So as we say, that we do have plans to field the second version of this to get deeper into it, and just even those nuances of what did we mean by fundraising by phone are things that we can then flush out in how we ask the questions. So definitely keep that kind of feedback coming to us if anything comes to mind after the presentation.
Yeah, totally agree.
Okay, Glenn or Bethany, do you have anything else any closing thoughts? I think we've covered a lot of material, which is great. So with that, then just a quick couple of notes. We really hope that you enjoyed the webinar. Thank you so much for participating and for attending today. We will be distributing a follow-up to this event. We will share the presentation as well as the recording of the event. So I got a couple of questions about whether or not people can share this with their teams. Please do. And then if you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to any one of us or your contact at PMX. And with that, everyone have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.